Yes, I think that is perfect. So
Okay.
please go ahead. Thanks so much.
Okay, thank you very much to the organizers for having me here. So sorry not to be in person. You might know that I had a flight through Dubai that I couldn't change in any way or cancel, and now with the war, it's impossible to go. It's really a pity because I see the contents of the conferences. It really looks great. Anyways, so I'm going to give you a perspective of a kind of ambitious project that we started to push forward with some colleagues at the Santa Fe Institute that have to do with trying to see if we can actually define strong laws for the logic of life, um, not only here but elsewhere, and how this, in a way, informs us about the limits of what can be engineered. So in a way, all this story starts with the problem of prediction, which is something that aware that in science is kind of a very central topic. The Laplace demon that I have here is kind of the first attempt to actually define the problem of prediction from physics. The idea that knowing the initial condition, you can actually extrapolate about the future and know everything that's going to happen. So is to what extent prediction is possible is something that has been discussed for a very, very long time. We have this center in Barcelona, the Collaboratorium, where part of the work we do, it's about predictive biology. But we do know that even in physics, prediction is something that might be very difficult to achieve due to emergent phenomena. And I put this paper here by Lowling and my former colleague, David Pines, where with this, under this title, which hides some kind of sarcasm, about the theories of everything, they kind of point out that, in fact, even in statistical physics, in the physics of n-body problems, as soon as you get into a handful of particles, you start to have trouble in actual making predictions from your formalism. This is not something that is trivial, but there are several ways in which we can approach this problem of prediction. So what I'm going to do is to kind of summarize some of the aspects that we treat in this paper that was published in 2024 and received a prize from the International Society of Artificial Life. With a bunch of colleagues, we present this idea, which is actually, in a way, a manifesto about suggesting, and that's the big idea, that the logic of living systems is likely to be exactly the same here and elsewhere, in exoplanets or in the life we can create in the lab. The paper contains a lot of stuff. It's a thick paper. I'm not going to talk about everything. I'm going to point into a few ideas. And we start the paper with a question that is going to be interesting for many of you. We start with the idea of imagine that a space probe lands on a distant planet. And the question is, how do you know that you are observing life, right? One big problem, of course, is that we have the reference, the n=1 experiment that we know well, but that might fail to actually identify lives elsewhere. And that also connects with the idea of constraints, whether or not constraints, so kind of fundamental basic laws that limit the potential that can be achieved by living systems is there. And there are many, many, many connected questions. And one of those that is not less relevant is if there are constraints, what are the limits that can actually constrain what is possible to design using, for example, synthetic biology. So a lot of the ideas I'm going to discuss start some years ago when we did this working group at the Santa Fe Institute in trying to figure out if we can actually look at major evolutionary transitions in a synthetic perspective, synthetic meaning using artificial life, using synthetic biology, using evolutionary robotics. So what kind of things we can do in the lab that mimic evolutionary transitions? And that's my own contribution to this special issue in philosophical transactions, where I pointed out that one of the potentially useful languages here is the language of phase transitions in physics, where we can actually identify shifts, qualitative shifts within different kinds of organization. And in a way, this allows us to find out also potential universal principles beyond the specific details of the system. So what else? Well, in our search of laws for that, one very important aspect is to what extent contingency plays a role. If contingency, so to speak, historical path dependence is relevant in shaping what can emerge in a system, Stephen Jay Gould defended this idea that history is so important in evolution that if we were able to go back in time and see evolution happening again from, for example, the Precambrian, we will observe a completely different biosphere, right? Something that could call an alien biosphere. And that's kind of a summarize of the argument in Wonderful Life. Is that the case? Well, other people has also argued about that. Jacques Monod, for example, was pretty much in this direction, saying that randomness plays a very important role. But there's, of course, a different way of looking at that, which is the way of thinking in the potential constraints that occur, in particular in development, right? I put here the Waddington demon, which would be the equivalent of the Laplace. You have information about the microscopic features of a system, gene networks, molecular interactions. Can you actually predict what's coming out from this, embryos and organs and nervous systems? And the thing here is that several people, including my former mentor, Brian Goodwin, kind of pretty much argued about the possibility that there are strong limits into what is possible. In this book, Life Solution, that I like very much, it's controversial as many other books. Life Solution is not a self-help book. It's a book about convergent evolution. So Simon Cowey-Morris makes a very strong argument saying that, well, you see in nature, many things seem to be evolving independently many times and ending up in basically the same solutions. And to a large extent, the whole story of the paper, I'm going to discuss some part of it. These constraints to the logic of living systems comes from discussions with my colleague and friend, Stuart Kaufman, that has proposed this idea. I put here the Kaufman demon, that because of the combinatorial nature of living systems, it might be very difficult, if not impossible, to make a theory of evolution in the sense of predictable evolution. What's the next layer in this universe of possibilities? And that's he calls the adjacent possible, right? I'm saying this in a very quick way. But I think that there's a counter argument for that, and that's what I want to explain. And of course, I'm a pretty much science fiction person. There's a lot of interesting, inspiring ideas that comes from the science fiction literature about alternative forms of life, crystal replicating systems, living planets, the black cloud, and so on and so forth. And I put this sentence here: the imagination of nature is far greater than the imagination of man, by Feynman. Is that so? Well, how can we actually say something, make a theoretical framework for finding out these potential universal principles, right? And there are several ways in which we can approach this from physics, as I mentioned before. Computational information theory, of course, provides strong bounds that have a more formal mathematical nature. What artificial life models bring, because artificial life is not bounded to, as you know very well, to the constraints of living systems, and what synthetic biology, for example, can say. And I went very quickly, and I will point out the vision of some pioneers, and you'll see what I'm talking about. The first step is this. What about the universal logic of information? If we go to another planet, are we going to find out if there's life, something that avoids linear polymers in some way? Well, let me give you two hints about what I think is the vision of pioneers, which in the paper we treat as some glimpse that people ahead of their time, ahead of, for example, molecular biology, had deep intuitions about what could be the reasonable way in which life could, for example, replicate itself. You probably all know about Schrödinger because he's been cited so many times with this idea that he formulated that whatever was the genetic material had to be something like an aperiodic crystal, right? Which is kind of very, very interesting intuition because in a way DNA is a periodic system. It's a kind of a organized regular system, say crystal, but it has to be aperiodic to contain information. What not so many people know is about Nikolai Koltsov, a Russian scientist who, before Schrödinger, and I think it was 1927, he said that whatever molecules are that are involved in replicating life, they're responsible for heredity, they have to be giant linear polymers that are complementary and replicate through semi-conservative mechanisms, which is kind of incredibly clever vision. I'm using that to point out that it's interesting to see that when people formulated the theories long before Watson Crick and Franklin discovery of DNA structure, they pretty much nailed down the logic, right? And this connects with another thing that I think is interesting to mention, which is the Turing perspective of how to define a computational system, right? And the Turing metaphor, which is, as you know, based on this idea of very, very long tape that is read by a machine, it kind of fits with something that we observe inside cells, right? Which is molecular machines reading long linear tapes. Why I'm mentioning this? Well, I'm mentioning this because, in fact, there are several things to say about this. The first thing is that, of course, the emergence of polymers, which is something that chemically is potentially possible, right? It's some likely thing to happen, although most polymers are very boring, implies a revolution. As soon as you have a polymer, you have access to a sequence space. Sequence space means that you have access to combinatorics, which can be extremely high, and evolution by natural selection. I point here into very important pioneers, Howard Patti, who pretty much pointed into this direction, and Mateusz Rocha. And I also want to point out that, in the recent years, it's been interesting to see that there's a lot of structure in the landscape of sequences that suggest that even by chance, it's easy to jump into higher fitness. And that changes, I cannot go into the details, that changes a bit the perspective that Stuart Kaufman defends on non-ergodic universe and the relevance of that. Well, one interesting candidate that you could say, because what I'm saying is that linear polymers might be the solution for early replicators in living in life here, elsewhere, or that you can design. Of course, you could say, well, maybe two-dimensional substrates could also work. And there's been a lot of thinking on that. There's been a lot of tries to use nucleotides to build two-dimensional substrates. But there's a big problem here. It's a big problem, which is how do you get there? How do you build these surface genomes, if you want to say that? Because you can do it, but a very important thing is that this has to be read in a reliable way. It's not enough to store, you need to read. Take the tree rings in trees, right? We can read the tree rings, but the trees cannot do that, right? So it's information that is not available. In that respect, is a very different story. So in the paper, we make several conjectures, and I forgot to mention, but this is now part of the research we're doing, try to prove these things. One is that molecular information, which requires storage and processing, so store and read, requires necessarily linear polymers. And that has a very important consequence because if linear polymers are a requirement, a universal kind of feature of life here and elsewhere, is a very limited repertoire that we know about potential monomer candidates. So nucleotides are one, amino acids is another, because you need to connect with two networks. But there's not much more, to tell the truth. And I just wanted to mention that this is ongoing research I'm doing with Chris Kempis and David Wolpert to build a theoretical framework for exploring alternatives to the linear polymer picture, so two-dimensional substrates, branched systems, DNA to protein, direct, straightforward, stochastic genomes. And I think we have made an amazingly important progress. So maybe we can actually provide evidence that the linear choice is the only one that logically is available for life. So next step, cells. Cells are a very clearly fundamental building block of life that we know in our planet. Everything that is alive is made either by single cells or by combinations of cells. So are cells something like an inevitable building block of living systems? So we find life somewhere else. Is cell organization something that might be also inevitable? In the paper, we argue about that using several arguments. And of course, one of the pioneers in this idea, the visionaries, is von Neumann, that I'm sure that, sorry, many of you know that he formulated this theoretical approach to the idea of how a machine can replicate itself. And it's also beautifully interesting to see that von Neumann stumbles into the idea that you have to have this dual nature of information, some information that has to guide the process of replication, and on the other hand, has to be replicated in the end. And then you have this set of building blocks, the applicator, controller, constructor, that when you show this to a biologist, you almost immediately get into the idea that, well, you're showing me the logic of cellular life, how a cell works, right? And again, we use that as an argument to say, well, when a theory is formulated to see kind of potential universal picture of how a replicating system works, you stumble into something that is already the biology we know. We suggest that this is because the architecture of life and life as fundamental building blocks is inevitable, is part of the logic of life. Of course, there's a lot of stuff here that can be said. When you look at real life with all the soft matter that is there, you might have things that emerge from self-organization, right? And how the membranes change and shift, and how this guides the process of replication, which is something we haven't yet solved. In a way, replaces part of the von Neumann constructor pieces, right? Something that we've been doing over the years, and always emphasize that we still need to go into a theoretical framework that fully explains this process, right? Cellular self-replication is a problem to a large extent in physics, in chemistry, and we don't have even a closed thermodynamic model of a cell cycle. The conjecture we make in this respect is very clear, right? The fundamental units of life is embodied individuals, thermodynamic open systems that can be described under the von Neumann logic. All right, let me make a jump. In the paper is a whole chunk of ideas about development, and I can't go into that because this is too long. Let me jump into cognition because it's something that nowadays is becoming more and more interesting. Cognition is relevant because it's connected with the idea of agency. I like this paper by John Hopfield. Not so many people knows about it. It's physics, computation, and why biology looks so different. Where Hopfield argues that one of the distinctions you can make between a physical and a biological entity is the presence of computation. Computation meaning that biological entities gather information, store, and process it to respond to the environment. In a way, this is something that happens actively and connects with the idea of agency. And one of the things that we've been exploring over the years in many different perspectives has to do precisely with the idea of what kind of cognitions are there, right? What kind of things we observe, and what kind of things we do not observe. We don't see ants with very large brains acting like as individual smart agents that connect with some of the things that we heard in the previous talk. We don't see brains that are not bilateral, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And more recently, it's been clear that even the way in which the logical architecture of brains is organized, has been experiencing a huge convergence between very different kind of organisms, for example, birds and mammals. I really recommend this science paper. It's really, really interesting. So one particular thing that we address in our paper is what about the logic of cognitive systems in terms of the units that are used to actually uh, build the cognitive networks, right? And what we conjecture is that it's interesting that neurons are so widespread, and by neurons meaning these polar threshold elements, which, as you know, we can describe in terms of formal threshold systems from McCulloch and Pitts. And you could say that, evolution has been experimenting with cognitive systems for millions of years. Why the multi-layer architecture with some particular loops, of course, based on these elements, neurons that are so interesting kind of cell types. I tell my students all the time that when you look at cells, sometimes you can identify, looking at the anatomy of cells, what do they do? And what happens with neurons, right? Use these hugely branched systems. Well, why so many branches? Because what you're looking for is information. You look for connections. Interestingly, when you look at genetic networks, where you have this formal approach that is also based on many genes, sorry, coding for transcription factors that in a way can tune the activity of genes, you stumble into a logic that is pretty much the same. And what we conjecture in the paper is that, in fact, the reason that you don't observe a variety of different kind of architectures for neurons, right? That the polar threshold element is so universal, is because it's the single solution to this. And from that, we can connect with something else that is, I think, quite fascinating, is that in the historical development of neural networks, people got inspired in our understanding of the visual cortex, which is a multi-layer system. That inspired several people to build, the deep networks that we are so familiar with. And again, we could argue, why is that? Why not other architectures? Why the multi-layer seems to be such a successful solution? Well, in this paper, which is connected with the paper I was mentioning with one of my former students, Luis Seoane, we argue that actually in our way into general artificial intelligence, it's likely that we cannot avoid things that were fundamentally relevant in shaping the human mind. In particular, for example, along with embodiment, which of course is very important, time. Time, I just mentioned this one, right? Time is relevant because one thing that is not yet in any machine is our capacity for not only going back in time and looking at our memories and navigate through them, but also invent futures, right? Not one, many futures. And that made a huge difference for us, right? That's something that is not yet in the machines. And in the paper with Luis, we made also this morphospace in trying to organize the complexity of both natural and artificial systems in this space, which is a qualitative space, right? We use computational complexity, autonomy, and agent interaction, so the relevance of social interactions that was pointed before also in the previous talk, to actually locate in space different ways in which nature and human designs have been exploring the space of possibilities. And one of the interesting lessons of morphospaces is that along with the way in which solutions cluster in different places, you also have big empty spaces. And the voids usually provide us relevant information about what is possible, what are the constraints, what could be the limits of evolutionary search, and also maybe the possibilities that we have to fill the voids using engineering. So in the paper, we made these conjectures. Cognitive agents will carry out information processing using these particularly interesting polar systems with threshold dynamics, which is neurons. And we conjecture that this is the solution for any cognitive system. And one of the consequences is that because of this architecture, the multi-layer architecture or the multi-layer solution to complex cognition is also maybe the only one. And I am also going into the end. What about ecosystems? And that might sound like a bit crazy because ecosystems are such a diverse, complex thing. What kind of universals can we actually define here? Well, it's interesting because ecosystems also display very, very diverse ecosystems display very general laws. I'm not going to go into the scaling laws that have been observed and the metabolic scaling. There's a lot of things that clearly are inevitable and that might constrain a lot the architecture of these systems. One thing that I want to point out is that when you look at the fossil record, what you do identify is communities made by collections of agents that you can easily classify as prey, predators, symbionts, detritivores, etc., etc., etc. You can actually even reconstruct the network of interactions. And I could ask, so maybe there's something that goes through time as universals that from the past to the present. And what can be said about that potential universals from artificial life? I put this example again by a visionary, Barricelli, who was working with one of the first computers. And the story is very well explained in these books by George Tyson. Barricelli was doing experiments in trying to test his ideas about symbiogenesis. And he made these first artificial life experiments with ecosystems where you actually see the emergence of this kind of symbiogenic relationships, but also parasites. Parasites really fuck up everything in many experiments, as you probably know from your own experience in artificial life. And they seem to be a very much inevitable piece of the story, right? And that's something that Tom Ray himself observed with Tierra, with these systems, that one of the things that you do observe as kind of inevitable thing is the emergence of parasites. And this seems to be kind of a pretty much common principle, right? So in the paper, what we argue here is that, in fact, if you were able to build a tree of life where you aggregate the different kinds of ecological behaviors, right? That imagine that you have from sigma 0 to sigma 1, you evolve a system, an artificial system, for example, where you observe, you classify different species, if you want, as I said before, right? Preys and predators and whatever. You will find, and that's the prediction we have, you will have a short number of classes that are inevitable, that belongs to the logic of ecological interactions, a thick branch, which is parasites, right? Viruses, so to speak. And in the paper, we argue that the possible organization of networks anywhere will display this kind of classes that we already know. That's an inevitable part of the story. And in particular, and it's something I like especially, that parasites are inevitable. Parasites, that's kind of our intuition about the nature we know, right? That parasites are there across scales everywhere. The idea is that parasites are an inevitable component of the logic of life, and we are working on that also. And the final thought that I wanted to share is that we also discussed the idea of what about the law itself that is responsible for generating complexity? So natural selection, of course, is one of our guiding principles as extremely powerful theory. But of course, you could argue, and you know that is an important issue within artificial life and origins of life. What happened before? I mean, it was always natural selection operating. It was maybe other kinds of laws that could generate complexity. And for example, as an example, I use this idea of what about a biosphere, what you can create. I mean, complex structures might emerge and that just self-sustain themselves, that they do not replicate. Is this possible? And is this something that can compete with natural selection as soon as it emerges? Again, we defend the idea that probably natural selection is an inevitable law. As soon as it's possible, it emerges because you have replicators. I like this sentence by Leonard Susskind because it comes from a very, very different context. It's from the cosmology perspective of Physics, when it says that modern cosmology really began with Darwin and Wallace, kind of pointing in the idea that there are underlying fundamental logic principles that guide the emergence of complexity even in the cosmos. So the conjecture we made in the paper is that as soon as it emerges, natural selection becomes the engine of evolutionary change. And that implies that you need replicators, of course, and maybe also likely the fundamental machine. So you would say, okay, so if the logic of life is universal and you go somewhere else in another planet, you'll see the same things. Well, in fact, there's a lot of stuff, and we end the paper with that, that has to do with the phenotypic plasticity involved in life, right? Even in our planet, there are things that, despite there are also universal features in the brain and the eyes and the behavior of octopuses, there's a lot of space for complexity, right? But also, do not forget that also there are things that, even in these cases, contain the logic of living systems. So we end the paper saying this, right? If we are right, the logic of life elsewhere is likely to be quite familiar. And I thank all my collaborators for all over the years working with me in complex systems. And that will be all. Thank you very much. Let me
Okay, thank you very much for the talk. Are there any questions from the floor?
try to unshare now.
いいですか？はい、hi, Ricard. This
Hello.
is Takashi Ikegami. Hi.
Hey, hi.
Hey, nice to see you.
Glad to hear.
Yeah, I think, my question is, I think large language model is the big discovery since discovery of chaos. But what do you think? Do you think, have you ever thought of, using LLM to model or, as a new concept in understanding evolution and biology?
Yeah, well, of course, we are in the midst. You hear me well?
Yep.
Okay, so we are in the midst of a revolution, so it's a lot of stuff going on. One thing we have been using, just to mention, we have been using artificial intelligent agents, particular multi-agent reinforcement learning, to explore, for example, a problem that I think is quite fascinating in the context we are discussing, which is the emergence of agriculture. Can we have a society of artificial agents that can discover the rules, right? Discover that, for example, that seeds are a plan for the future? The answer is yes. And it's been really fascinating. And we just started to stumble into LLM societies. It's of course plenty of stuff to explore here as a way, as a microscope to explore agency and things like that. But we're just starting. Yeah.
I see. Yep. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, maybe I can also ask one question. Thank you so much. So I was interested in, especially with your conjectures. So one, especially the one with neurons always universally converging to these multi-layer structures. So I could see how you got the consequence from the conjecture. Like it seems reasonable that if you have these threshold small components, then the only way to make a truly intelligent architecture may be limited to that kind of multi-layer.
I don't hear. Okay. Okay, for a moment I couldn't hear.
Oh.
Now
okay.
here.
Okay.
Sure.
Did you understand my question?
I didn't get the question. So
okay. So the question was like, how did you arrive to the conjecture, first of all? Like I could see the implication part, but how you arrived to the original conjecture was unclear to me.
Of course, yes. Well, there's kind of, say, two sides. One is that when you look at the biosphere, the choice of neurons, the way we know, is essentially universal, with one exception, with those Cnidarians that have this strange net of neurons that pretty much fuse to each other. Everyone seems to take that, right? And
I see.
evolution will have evolved very different things in principle. But and the other thing is that if you look at artificial life, and that's the domain where we are trying to move. What if we evolve cognitive systems where the elements can be have different architectures, right? We haven't yet solved that. I'm open to collaborations if there's any suggestion. But the thing is that it's also interesting that given that people has explored artificial takes of cognitive systems in many directions, nobody has stumbled into something that is different from containing the multi-layer, right? That's kind of suspicious, right?
I see. So it's basically from these very strong observational empirical evidence.
Yes, we are working on trying to make this a theory, right? So that it's not
Right.
just kind of the intuition of this kind of seems to be universal, right?
I see. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Okay, so okay, I think our time is running out. So okay, if there's no other questions, thank you. Let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Professor Sol.
Thank you.
Okay, so yeah, we will have a 10-minute break until